The wood stove violations letter arrived on the coldest morning of December, sitting in my mailbox like a ticking bomb wrapped in official HOA letterhead. I'm Patrick Jensen, and I'd been living in Cedar Ridge Estates, Montana for 3 years without a single problem until Deborah Preston became the new HOA president. The letter stated that my wood stove produced excessive smoke that violated community standards, despite the fact that I'd been heating my home with that same stove since I moved in. The ultimatum was clear: cease using the wood stove immediately or face daily fines starting at $500. Standing in my driveway that morning, watching my breath crystallize in the air, I read the letter 3 times. My property sat on the edge of Cedar Ridge Estates, 5 acres with thick timber coverage that bordered the national forest. The development was one of those semi-rural communities where people moved to escape city regulations, ironically enough. My nearest neighbor was Deborah herself, living about 200 yards down the private road we shared. I walked back inside where my golden retriever, Scout, waited by the door. The wood stove crackled in the corner of my living room, throwing heat that made the December morning bearable. I'd installed it myself when I moved in, hiring a certified professional to ensure everything met code. The chimney was properly lined, the clearances were correct, and I burned only seasoned hardwood. There shouldn't have been excessive smoke at all. My phone rang before I could process the letter fully. It was my neighbor, George Martinez, who lived on the other side of the development. "Patrick, did you get one too?" he asked. "Get what?" "A violation letter. Deborah sent me one about my satellite dish, says it's an eyesore." "Yeah, I got mine. Wood stove smoke violations," George sighed heavily. "She's been president for 2 months, and she's already targeting half the neighborhood. There's a meeting tonight at 7. Community Center. You coming?" "Absolutely." That evening, I drove through the winding roads of Cedar Ridge Estates to the small community center near the entrance gates. 23 homes made up our development, and from what I could see, at least 15 owners had shown up. The room buzzed with angry conversations. Deborah Preston stood at the front, a woman in her late 40s with severely cut blonde hair and a pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my truck. She held a gavel like she was presiding over the Supreme Court instead of a neighborhood meeting. "Order, please. Let's have order." She banged the gavel twice. "I understand many of you received violation notices this week. These are necessary corrections to bring our community up to the standards we all agreed to when we purchased our properties." "That's garbage, Deborah." This came from Sarah Mitchell, who'd lived here longer than anyone. "I've had my garden gnomes for 8 years. Nobody complained until you showed up. The covenants clearly state lawn decorations must be tasteful and subdued," Deborah replied coolly. "A family of 20 ceramic gnomes doesn't qualify." I raised my hand. "What about my wood stove? I have documentation showing it meets all county and state regulations. What specific standard am I violating?" Deborah's eyes fixed on me like a hawk spotting prey. "The smoke from your chimney is visible, Mr. Jensen. It creates an unpleasant atmosphere and likely contains particulates harmful to the community. It's called heating my house. We live in Montana. There are cleaner alternatives: natural gas, electric heat, modern heat pumps. None of which I'm required to use. The covenants don't ban wood stoves." She smiled thinly. Section 12, Paragraph 4. Residents must not create conditions that negatively impact the aesthetic or environmental quality of Cedar Ridge Estates. Your smoke qualifies. "That's subjective interpretation," George called out. "You're stretching the rules to fit whatever you don't like." The meeting dissolved into arguments. Deborah kept banging her gavel, citing various covenant sections that she claimed gave her authority to enforce these new standards. By the end of the night, nothing was resolved except that the violation stood and fines would begin if we didn't comply. I drove home furious. My wood stove was the primary heat source for my house. Sure, I had electric baseboard heaters as backup, but they'd cost me a fortune to run through a Montana winter. More importantly, it was the principle. I owned my property. I'd followed the rules. And now Deborah wanted to dictate how I heated my home because she personally found smoke aesthetically displeasing. The next morning, I called the installer who'd done my stove work. Marcus Thompson ran a chimney service and had 30 years of experience. "Patrick, I remember your installation. That was textbook perfect," he said when I explained the situation. "If you're getting visible smoke, something might be wrong. Mind if I come take a look?" He arrived that afternoon with his inspection equipment. I hadn't used the stove since receiving the letter, worried about those daily fines. Marcus climbed onto my roof, checked the chimney, examined the stove itself, and finally stood back with his hands on his hips. "Nothing wrong here. You burning seasoned wood. 2-year seasoned oak and maple. I'm careful about it. Then you shouldn't have much visible smoke at all. Maybe a light haze on startup, but that's it." He paused. "Unless someone's been tampering with something." That thought hadn't occurred to me. Like what? Your rain cap, your chimney damper. If someone partially blocked your flue, you'd get smoke backing up and coming out inefficiently. He pointed to the cap. "This looks fine now, but keep an eye on it." After Marcus left, I sat on my porch thinking. Deborah lived close enough to walk to my property. The private road we shared meant she passed my house regularly. Could she have done something to create a smoke problem that didn't previously exist? It seemed paranoid, but I couldn't shake the suspicion. I decided to test something. That evening, I started a fire in the stove, using proper technique with newspaper, kindling, and well-seasoned oak. I went outside to observe. The smoke was minimal, just a faint wisp that dissipated quickly in the cold air. Nothing excessive, nothing that should trigger violations. Then I walked down to where Deborah could see my chimney from her property. From that angle, even the minimal smoke was more visible against the darkening sky. Still not excessive by any reasonable standard, but visible. My phone rang at 8 p.m. "Deborah, Mr. Jensen, I can see smoke from your chimney. You were instructed to cease use immediately. I'm testing my stove to verify it's functioning properly. You're violating HOA directives. That's $500 for today. Send me the fine notice. I'll see you in court." I hung up, my heart pounding. This was escalating fast, but I wasn't going to be bullied. The next few days were tense. I continued using my wood stove because I needed heat, and my electric bills were already creeping up from trying to use the baseboards more. Another violation notice arrived, then another. Deborah was documenting every instance of visible smoke. Then George called with news that changed everything. "Patrick, you need to hear this. I was talking to Jim Reynolds, the guy who was HOA president before Deborah. He told me she's been planning this." "Planning what?" Her husband owns a natural gas installation company. "They've been pushing to get gas lines extended into Cedar Ridge. If she can force everyone off wood heat and other alternatives, we'd all need gas. It's a money scheme." That made my blood boil. That's a conflict of interest. Jim said he tried to warn people, but Deborah's really good at playing politics. She got elected by promising to maintain property values and enforce standards. Most people didn't realize what that meant until now. I started digging. Montana has public records requirements for HOAs. I requested all financial documents and communications from the current board. Deborah tried to stonewall me, but I cited the specific statute that required disclosure. A week later, I received a thick envelope. Inside, I found correspondence between Deborah and Preston Gas Services, her husband's company. They'd been discussing plans to service Cedar Ridge estates, with projected revenue based on converting homes from wood and propane to natural gas. There were notes about encouraging adoption and creating necessity. This was exactly the ammunition I needed, but I also needed a lawyer. I contacted Jennifer Wu, an attorney in Kalispell who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. "This is problematic for her," Jennifer said after reviewing the documents. "She has a clear financial interest that she didn't disclose. That violates Montana's Nonprofit Corporation Act, which governs HOAs. But here's the thing, fighting this will take time and money. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to not let her push me around." "Then let's file a formal complaint and request an injunction against the fines while we sort this out." We filed in Flathead County District Court right before Christmas. The hearing was set for mid-January, which meant I had to survive the holiday season under the threat of mounting fines. I continued using my wood stove because I couldn't afford not to. The fines accumulated on paper, but I wasn't paying them. Deborah sent increasingly aggressive letters threatening liens against my property. The really cold weather hit during the first week of January. Montana cold, the kind that makes your nose hairs freeze instantly and turns your breath into clouds of ice crystals. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero, and that's when things got interesting. My property included about 5 acres of timber, mostly lodge pole pine, Douglas fir, and some hardwoods. Over the 3 years I'd lived there, I'd been carefully managing it, clearing dead trees and thinning overgrowth. This generated a substantial amount of firewood, more than I could use myself. I'd been selling cords of wood to neighbors and people in nearby Whitefish for extra income. Deborah wasn't my only customer, but several people in Cedar Ridge estates bought wood from me regularly. During the previous 2 winters, I'd sold cords to at least 8 different homes in the development. They all had wood stoves or fireplaces, and they appreciated having a local, reliable source for quality seasoned firewood. On January 8th, I got a call from Tom Hendricks, one of my regular customers from the development. "Hey Patrick, I'm getting low on wood. Can I get another cord delivered this week? I'd been expecting this." "Sorry, Tom, I'm not selling firewood anymore." "What? Why not?" "HOA issues. If the board doesn't want smoke in the neighborhood, I figure I shouldn't be contributing to the problem by supplying the fuel. Wouldn't want to be responsible for any covenant violations." There was a long pause. "That's because of Deborah's campaign against you, isn't it? Let's just say I'm being conscientious about community standards." Tom swore softly. "I've only got about a week's worth left. Where else can I get wood around here?" "There's a supplier in Columbia Falls, about 30 miles away, or Kalispell. Prices are probably higher than what I was charging, especially with gas costs for delivery out here." After Tom hung up, I felt a twinge of guilt. These were my neighbors, people I liked, but they'd all stayed silent when Deborah started attacking me. Nobody had spoken up at the meetings or challenged her authority. A few had even sided with her, agreeing that something should be done about standards. 2 days later, Sarah Mitchell called. Then George. Then 3 more people from the development. Same conversation each time. They were running low on firewood. Could they buy from me? Each time I politely declined, citing my desire to reduce smoke in the community. The irony was beautiful. By mid-January, half of Cedar Ridge estates was scrambling for firewood during the coldest stretch of winter in 5 years. The Columbia Falls supplier was charging nearly double what I'd been asking, plus significant delivery fees for coming out to our rural development. Some people made the drive themselves, hauling wood in pickup trucks and SUVs, burning gas and time. Meanwhile, my timber land remained full of processed, seasoned firewood, stacked neatly under tarps. I had enough to last myself through 3 winters, plus surplus I could have sold. But I didn't sell a single piece. The court hearing arrived on January 14th. Judge Morrison presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. Jennifer presented our case clearly. Deborah had a financial conflict of interest. The smoke violations were subjective and unsupported by objective evidence, and the fines were punitive and excessive. Deborah's lawyer, a guy named Richard Stoll from a firm in Kalispell, argued that the HOA had broad authority to interpret covenants and that Deborah's husband's business was irrelevant to the smoke issue. Judge Morrison listened to both sides, reviewed the documents, and delivered her ruling from the bench. The court finds that Miss Preston's failure to disclose her financial interest in converting homes to natural gas represents a conflict of interest that calls into question her motives in pursuing these violations. However, the court also finds that the HOA covenants are ambiguous enough to potentially support the interpretations advanced by the board. Therefore, the court orders the following. First, all fines against Mr. Jensen are suspended pending an independent inspection of his wood stove and chimney by a certified professional, agreed upon by both parties. Second, the HOA must hold a special election to address the conflict of interest issue. Third, the HOA board must adopt clear, objective standards for any future smoke or emissions violations. These findings and orders will be reduced to writing within 7 days. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. The fines were gone, at least temporarily, and Deborah's conflict was now on the record. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt cautiously optimistic. Jennifer warned me that Deborah might appeal or find other ways to make my life difficult, but at least we'd established some boundaries. The special election was scheduled for February. In the meantime, the deep freeze continued. Temperatures stayed below 0 for days at a stretch, the kind of cold that tests every heating system. My wood stove kept my house at a comfortable 70 degrees while using minimal electricity. I had Scout curled up by the stove most days, living his best life. Other people in Cedar Ridge weren't so comfortable. Tom Hendricks knocked on my door one evening in late January, looking exhausted. "Patrick, I know you're not selling wood, but I'm desperate. My fireplace is supplemental heat and my propane bills are killing me. Can you make an exception?" "I'll pay whatever you want." I genuinely felt bad for Tom. He was a decent guy, a retired teacher who'd moved to Montana to enjoy the wilderness. But I also knew that if I sold to him, word would spread and soon everyone would be asking. "Tom, I can't. If I'm supplying firewood while fighting violations for wood smoke, how does that look in court?" "Right, yeah, I understand." He looked miserable. "This cold snap can't last forever, right?" "Nothing does." After he left, Scout looked up at me with those expressive dog eyes that seemed to ask if I was being too harsh. Maybe I was. But Deborah had started this fight, and I was seeing it through. The cold snap finally broke in early February, just before the special election. When voting day arrived, I made sure to be at the community center early. The election was specifically about removing Deborah as president due to the conflict of interest, with Jim Reynolds willing to step back in temporarily if she was removed. 20 homes showed up to vote. The result was 16-4 in favor of removing Deborah. She left the community center without a word, her face frozen in fury. Jim Reynolds took over immediately. His first act was to call an emergency board meeting to review all pending violations. I attended along with a dozen other residents who'd received notices. "Let's be clear," Jim said, addressing the room. "This board exists to maintain common areas and handle legitimate issues. We're not here to micromanage how people live on their own property. If something violates county code, that's one thing, but personal preferences aren't grounds for violations." He went through each case. The satellite dish was fine. The garden gnomes were fine. My wood stove was fine, especially since the independent inspector had given it a perfect report. Everything was dismissed. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The fight was over. I'd won. Except it wasn't quite over. 2 days after the election, I got a call from George at 6 in the morning. "Patrick, you need to see this. Get down to the community center now." I drove down to find fire trucks and sheriff's vehicles everywhere. The community center was burning, flames shooting from the roof. Firefighters were containing the blaze, but the building was clearly a total loss. Sheriff Deputy Amanda Crawford was coordinating the scene. When things calmed down, she started interviewing residents. When my turn came, I explained that I'd left the meeting 2 nights ago around 9 p.m. and hadn't been back since. "We're treating this as suspicious," Deputy Crawford said. "The fire started in multiple locations. That's not accidental." My stomach dropped. "You think someone set it deliberately?" "Too early to say definitively, but it looks that way." Over the next few days, investigators combed through the ruins. They found evidence of accelerants and determined the fire had indeed been arson. The community center had contained all the HOA records, including the documents related to Deborah's conflict of interest and the violation notices. Suspicion naturally fell on Deborah. Sheriff's deputies questioned her extensively. She denied everything, claimed she'd been home alone that night. But she had no alibi, and the circumstantial evidence was damning. She'd just been publicly removed from power over a scandal that those records documented. The timing was too convenient. The investigation dragged on through February. Meanwhile, I resumed selling firewood to my neighbors. With the violations dismissed and Deborah no longer in power, there was no reason to continue the embargo. Tom Hendricks was my first customer again, followed by most of the others who'd bought from me before. "I appreciate you standing your ground," Tom said while I loaded a cord into his truck. "I should have spoken up during those meetings. I'm sorry I didn't." "Water under the bridge," I told him. In early March, the sheriff's department announced an arrest. But it wasn't Deborah they arrested. It was her husband, Russell Preston. According to Deputy Crawford's statement, Russell had been the one to set the fire. Investigators had found his credit card records showing a purchase at a hardware store in Kalispell for items consistent with starting fires. They'd also recovered surveillance footage showing his truck near the community center around the time the fire started. When confronted with the evidence, he'd confessed, claiming he'd done it to protect his wife and their business interests. Russell was charged with first-degree arson, a felony carrying up to 20 years in prison. Deborah was investigated as a potential accomplice, but prosecutors couldn't find enough evidence to charge her directly. However, the revelation destroyed what was left of her reputation in Cedar Ridge Estates. Within weeks, she'd put her house on the market and moved away. Jim Reynolds called a meeting in late March to discuss rebuilding the community center. Insurance would cover most of it, but we'd all need to approve special assessments to cover the difference. The mood was somber but determined. We'd been through a rough few months, but the community was still intact. "I want to thank Patrick for fighting back against the overreach," Jim said during the meeting. "He could have just paid the fines or given up, but he stood his ground. That forced us all to pay attention to what was happening with the board. People applauded, which felt strange but good. I hadn't been fighting for everyone. I'd been fighting for myself. But apparently it had mattered to others too. Spring arrived in Montana with its usual muddy glory. Snow melted, the private road became a morass of ruts and puddles, and life returned to normal. I continued heating with my wood stove on cold mornings, and nobody said a word about smoke. In May, Russell Preston pleaded guilty to arson and was sentenced to 12 years in prison with parole eligibility after 8. The judge called his actions a calculated attempt to destroy evidence and intimidate a community, which didn't help his case. Deborah attended the sentencing but left immediately after without speaking to reporters or anyone else. I never saw her again. Her house sold in June to a young couple from Seattle who were escaping city life. They introduced themselves to me within a week of moving in, friendly and excited about Montana living. When they asked about firewood suppliers, I gave them my card. By the following winter, everything had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The community center was rebuilt, better than before with modern insulation and solar panels. Jim Reynolds continued as HOA president, running things with a light touch that kept people happy. Property values stayed stable, proving that you didn't need draconian enforcement to maintain a neighborhood. I kept managing my timberland, selling firewood, and enjoying the peace of rural Montana. Scout got older, grayer around the muzzle, but still loved lying by the wood stove on cold mornings. Life was good. Looking back, the whole conflict seemed almost absurd. It had started with one person's petty desire for control and escalated into arson and prison time. All because Deborah couldn't tolerate the sight of smoke from a legal, properly installed wood stove. All because she saw an opportunity to profit by forcing her preferences onto others. But that's the thing about HOAs. They attract a certain type of person who craves authority over others. Give them a board position and some vaguely worded covenants, and suddenly they're dictating how you live on your own property. Most of the time, people just comply because fighting back is expensive and exhausting. I'd been lucky. I had documentation, a good lawyer, and enough stubbornness to see it through. The firewood embargo had been petty revenge, I'll admit that. But it had also been effective. Nothing makes people reconsider their priorities like freezing in their own homes during a Montana winter. When my neighbors realized they'd sided with someone who was making their lives harder, not better, opinions shifted fast. On a cold December morning exactly 2 years after receiving that first violation letter, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching smoke rise from my chimney into the clear blue sky. Scout lay at my feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the boards. The thermometer read 15 degrees, perfect wood stove weather. My phone rang. It was George. Morning, Patrick. Got a question for you. Shoot. New couple 3 houses down wants to install a wood stove. They're worried about HOA issues given the history. I told them it's fine now, but they wanted me to check with you first. I smiled. Tell them to get Marcus Thompson to do the installation. He'll make sure everything is perfect, and tell them welcome to the neighborhood. Will do. Hey, you got any firewood available? I'm running low. For you, George, always. After hanging up, I stood and stretched, breathing in the cold Montana air. Scout stood too, ready for whatever the day would bring. Inside, the wood stove crackled and popped, doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping my home warm through the winter. Deborah had wanted to ban my wood stove for smoke violations. Instead, she'd lost her position, her reputation, and her marriage. Her husband was in prison, and she'd been driven out of the community she'd tried to control. Meanwhile, I was still here, still burning wood, still living exactly as I chose on my own property. The smoke rose from my chimney, visible against the winter sky, perfectly legal and completely acceptable. That site would never be a problem again in Cedar Ridge Estates. I'd made sure of that. Sometimes standing your ground costs you time, money, and stress. Sometimes it means being petty and letting people face consequences of their choices. But sometimes it's absolutely worth it. This had been one of those times. I finished my coffee and headed inside to add another log to the fire. Scout followed, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. The wood stove was warming up nicely, ready to keep us comfortable through another cold Montana day. Outside, the timber on my property stood tall, ready to provide heat for many winters to come. Life in Cedar Ridge Estates had returned to what it should be. Neighbors living peacefully, respecting each other's choices, and saving the HOA for actual community issues rather than petty power plays. The community center stood rebuilt, a reminder of how badly things could go wrong when the wrong person gained control. But it also stood as a reminder that communities could heal and move forward. Russell Preston's arson had been intended to destroy evidence and intimidate people into silence. Instead, it had galvanized the neighborhood against that kind of corruption. Nobody wanted to return to those days. As winter deepened, my firewood business thrived. Word had spread beyond Cedar Ridge Estates, and I was selling cords to people throughout the Flatfish Valley. The combination of quality wood, fair prices, and reliable delivery meant I had more business than I could handle. I hired a local teenager, Marcus Thompson's nephew, to help with splitting and deliveries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Deborah had wanted to shut down wood burning in the neighborhood to benefit her husband's gas company. Instead, she'd inadvertently helped me build a thriving business based on providing the exact thing she tried to ban. In February, I received a letter from Jennifer Wu, my attorney. She'd sent a final bill for her services, along with a note thanking me for an interesting case. At the bottom, she'd written, "Sometimes the best legal victories are the ones that teach bullies they can't get away with overreach. You did good." I framed that note and hung it in my office, next to my permits, and the inspection report that proved my wood stove was perfect compliance with every regulation. Spring came again, bringing warm weather and the end of heating season. I spent the spring and summer managing my timber, cutting trees, splitting logs, and stacking everything to season for the next winter. It was hard physical work, but satisfying. There's something fundamentally good about providing for yourself, about living in harmony with the land around you. Scout passed away peacefully in his sleep that June. He was 12 years old, had lived a good life, and had been with me through the entire HOA battle. I buried him on my property under a Douglas fir, marking the spot with a stone I'd pulled from the creek. He'd earned his rest. A month later, I adopted another golden retriever puppy from a rescue in Kalispell. I named him Ranger, and he took to life in the Montana woods like he'd been born for it. By the time the next winter rolled around, he'd grown into a gangly adolescent who loved nothing more than lying by the wood stove, just like Scout had. Jim Reynolds served as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down. The community elected Maria Gonzalez to replace him, a retired Forest Service ranger who understood land management and respected property rights. Under her leadership, the HOA adopted clearer guidelines for everything, eliminating the ambiguous language that Deborah had exploited. I served on the Architectural Review Committee, helping to evaluate requests for modifications and improvements. It was ironic, given that I'd fought against HOA overreach, but I wanted to make sure the board stayed focused on reasonable standards rather than personal preferences. Most of my job involved approving things and occasionally suggesting modifications that would work better with Montana's climate. Time passed. Seasons cycled. The community stabilized and thrived. Russell Preston got out of prison after serving 9 years and moved to Idaho. I heard he was working construction, trying to rebuild his life away from Montana. Deborah had apparently remarried and moved to Arizona, as far from Montana winters as you could get while staying in the continental United States. None of that mattered to me anymore. The past was past. I'd won my fight, protected my rights, and helped ensure that Cedar Ridge Estates remained a place where people could live freely on their own property without arbitrary interference. 5 years after the initial violation letter, I stood in the same spot where I'd first read Deborah's ultimatum. The mailbox was the same, the driveway was the same, but everything else had changed. The community was stronger. The HOA was functional rather than oppressive, and I'd built a successful business while maintaining my independence. Ranger bounded up to me, carrying a stick he wanted me to throw. I obliged, watching him race across the snowy yard in pursuit. Smoke rose from my chimney, that same smoke that had started everything. But now it was just smoke, nothing more, doing its job of carrying heat away from a fire that kept my home warm. That's what it should have always been. Just smoke from a wood stove. Nothing worth fighting over. Nothing worth destroying a community over. But people like Deborah saw everything as an opportunity for control, every minor thing as something they needed to regulate and manage. The wood stove violations had been about power, not smoke. The fight had been about refusing to surrender that power, about standing firm when someone tried to bully you into compliance. And the aftermath had been about ensuring it couldn't happen again. I'd let them freeze without my timber when they tried to take away my right to heat my home as I chose. It had been harsh, but it had been necessary. Sometimes people need to feel the consequences of their choices before they understand the value of freedom. Walking back to my house, I thought about all the people who face similar battles with HOAs across America. Thousands of people dealing with overreaching boards, arbitrary violations, and petty tyrants who treat community leadership as personal fiefdoms. Most of them probably give in, pay the fines, make the changes, accept the control. I'd been lucky enough to fight back and win. Lucky enough to have documentation, resources, and stubbornness in the right proportions. Lucky enough that Deborah's corruption was blatant enough to prove in court. Not everyone has that luck. But maybe my story could inspire others to stand their ground when they know they're right. To push back against arbitrary authority. To demand that rules be clear, fairly applied, and actually necessary rather than just convenient for whoever happens to be in charge. Inside, I added wood to the stove. Ranger settled on his bed nearby. The house was warm, comfortable, mine. Everything I'd fought for was still here, still intact, still worth it. The smoke rose from my chimney, visible to anyone who cared to look. But nobody cared anymore. Nobody monitored it, documented it, or complained about it. It was just smoke, doing what smoke does, bothering absolutely nobody. That's freedom. That's what I'd been fighting for all along. The right to live peacefully on my own property, heating my home as I saw fit, without interference from people who thought they knew better. I'd won that fight. And every time I added a log to the wood stove, every time smoke rose from my chimney, every time I delivered a cord of firewood to a neighbor, I was reminded of that victory. Deborah had tried to ban my wood stove for smoke violations. So I'd let them freeze without my timber. In the end, I still had my stove, my timber, my property, and my freedom. She had nothing but a failed power grab and a ruined reputation. Justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always obvious. But sometimes, If you stand firm and refuse to be bullied, it arrives exactly when and how it should. This had been one of those times. The fire crackled in the stove. Ranger snored softly. Outside, Montana winter continued its beautiful, brutal cycle. And inside my home, heated by wood I'd cut myself, burned in a stove I'd installed legally, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, free.